Last night at the celebration dinner, my sister called me poor trash worker in front of everyone, but the guests had no idea they were sitting in the restaurant I built from the ground up. That night, everything started to crack. They thought they knew who I was, sitting there in their designer clothes, dismissing the woman who collected their garbage for years. They had no clue that every fork they held, every light that illuminated their smug faces, every carefully crafted dish they consumed, it all belonged to me. My name is Rachel Monroe, and at 34, I've learned that success has a peculiar way of making you invisible to the people who should see you most clearly. The text came through at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, while I was reviewing sustainability reports for my restaurant chain. Mom's contact photo, still the same forced smile from my college graduation 8 years ago, lit up my screen with a message that felt more like a court summons than an invitation. Melissa's engagement dinner, Saturday, 7 p.m., Everstone Hall. Try to dress appropriately. Mother. I stared at those words for a full minute, my coffee growing cold in the Denver morning air streaming through my office windows. Everstone Hall. Of all the restaurants in the city, they had chosen mine, the flagship location of the sustainable dining empire I'd built from nothing from literal garbage. If we're being precise about origins, they had no idea. My assistant knocked and entered with the quarterly reports, but I waved her away. This required thinking. Melissa, my 28-year-old sister, was getting engaged to Tyler Grayson, some tech entrepreneur she'd been dating for 8 months, the same sister who hadn't returned my calls in 2 years, the same sister who, at our last family gathering, had introduced me to her friends as the one with the weird recycling thing. I pulled up Everstone Hall's reservation system, my own system, and found their booking, party of 12, private dining room, premium wine package. They'd specifically requested our sustainability tour be excluded from the evening. The irony was so thick I could taste it. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Melissa directly. Hope you can make it. Would mean a lot to have family there. P.S. It's upscale, so maybe borrow something nice. Borrow something nice? I glanced down at my custom-tailored blazer, then around my corner office overlooking downtown Denver. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see 2 of my other restaurant locations in the distance. The business that started in a rented garage with industrial composting equipment now employed over 300 people across Colorado. But to them, I was still the girl who drove the recycling truck. I should have declined, should have sent regrets and a generous gift card to my own restaurant. Naturally, should have maintained the careful distance that had preserved what little remained of our family relationships. Instead, I found myself typing back, "I'll be there," because something dark and determined was crystallizing in my chest, something that whispered, let them sit in the space you created. Let them enjoy the menu you developed, the ambiance you designed, the service standards you implemented. Let them have their celebration in the monument to everything they told you you'd never achieve. Let them feast in your kingdom while treating you like a peasant. I called Devin, my general manager at Everstone Hall, and gave him a heads up. Family dinner Saturday night, private dining room 2. I'll be attending as a guest, not as ownership. Keep it quiet. Devin had been with me since the early days, when we served organic comfort food out of a converted food truck. He understood immediately. Understood. Rachel, should I brief the staff? Just the core team, and Devin let them have the full experience. Nothing held back. After hanging up, I leaned back in my chair and smiled for the first time all day. Saturday night was going to be interesting. They wanted family dinner at an upscale restaurant. They'd get exactly that. They just had no idea who would be picking up the check. I arrived at Everstone Hall at 6:45, 15 minutes before the reservation. The black jumpsuit I'd chosen was deceptively simple, sleek lines that could read as either understated elegance or service industry chic, depending on who was looking. Perfect for tonight's performance. The valet recognized me immediately but played his part flawlessly, offering only a subtle nod as he took my keys. I'd trained my staff well. Discretion was everything in this business. Walking through the entrance I'd designed 3 years ago, I felt that familiar surge of pride mixed with something sharper tonight. The reclaimed wood panels, the living moss wall, the carefully curated lighting that made everyone look like their best selves, every detail bore my fingerprints. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was my manifesto made tangible. Devin intercepted me near the host stand, his expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Monroe, your party is in the Sage Room. Should I—" "I'm just another guest tonight, Devin, but thank you." He nodded, understanding the game. 3 years of working together had taught him to read between the lines. "Of course. Enjoy your evening." I was studying my wine list when one of the newer servers approached. Jamie. I remembered from her hiring interview last month. Young, eager, still learning the ropes. "Excuse me, Miss, there's a small spill by table 7. Could you help me grab some towels from the service station?" The mistake was innocent enough. In my jumpsuit, standing alone in the dining room, I probably looked like staff to her. The old Rachel might have been embarrassed, might have corrected her immediately. Tonight's Rachel simply smiled. "Of course." I followed her to the service station, watching her efficient movements as she gathered cleaning supplies. This was the level of teamwork I'd fostered here, everyone helping everyone. No task too small. It was one of the principles that made Everstone Hall special. "Thanks so much," Jamie said, already hurrying back to her section. "You're a lifesaver." "Anytime," I replied, meaning it more than she could know. I made my way toward the Sage Room, passing the open kitchen where my head chef Marcus was orchestrating the evening service. He caught my eye through the pass and offered a barely perceptible smile. Another member of my inner circle, keeping the secret. The private dining room buzzed with conversation as I approached. Through the glass partition, I could see them, Mom in her pearls and passive aggression, Dad in his perpetual state of mild bewilderment, Melissa radiant in engagement bliss, and Tyler all teeth and confidence in a suit that probably cost more than my first food truck. The rest were family friends and Tyler's associates, the kind of people who measured success in stock options and vacation homes. I paused at the threshold, taking one last moment to appreciate the view. They were seated at the table I'd custom commissioned from a local woodworker, a single piece of reclaimed oak from a century-old barn, restored and polished until it gleamed. The centerpiece was a living arrangement I'd developed with our partner Urban Farm, seasonal blooms growing in repurposed wine barrels. Everything they would touch, taste, and admire tonight had been chosen by the woman they were about to treat like an afterthought. I stepped into the room. "Rachel." Melissa's voice carried that particular pitch of forced enthusiasm she'd perfected over the years. "You made it." The room turned toward me with polite interest and practiced smiles. Mom's eyes swept over my outfit with barely concealed disapproval. Dad offered a distracted wave before returning to his conversation about golf handicaps. "Wouldn't miss it," I said, accepting air kisses from Melissa and settling into the seat they'd obviously designated as mine, furthest from the guest of honor, closest to the wall. Tyler extended a hand with that grip that lasted just a beat too long, the kind men like him used to establish dominance. "You must be the famous sister. Melissa's told me so much about you." I doubted that, but smiled anyway. "All good things, I hope." "Of course," Melissa laughed, that tinkling sound she'd cultivated for social occasions. "Rachel keeps herself busy with her little projects." Little projects. I glanced around the room that represented just one small part of my empire, at the staff executing service standards I'd spent years developing, at the menu they'd soon order from that showcased my relationships with local farmers and artisans. "Something like that," I agreed, settling back to watch the show. The stage was set, the players were in position, and I was exactly where I needed to be, invisible in plain sight, surrounded by my own creation. Let the performance begin. The conversation flowed like expensive wine around topics I couldn't contribute to, or rather, topics they assumed I couldn't contribute to. Tyler's business partner regaled the table with stories of their recent acquisition spree. Mom's book club friend detailed her daughter's wedding in the Hamptons. Melissa and her college roommate compared notes on their upcoming girls' trip to Tuscany. I sat quietly, watching them navigate my space like tourists in a foreign country, completely unaware they were speaking a language I'd become fluent in years ago. The sustainability trend is so interesting right now, Tyler was saying, gesturing with his wine glass of vintage from our carefully curated collection. We're looking at investing in some green tech startups, really cutting-edge stuff. His words hung in the air as I studied the reclaimed copper light fixtures above our table. I'd sourced those personally from a demolished brewery in Detroit, spending weeks coordinating their restoration and installation. "That's wonderful, dear," Mom said, her voice carrying that warm approval she reserved for achievements she understood. "It's so important to think about the environment." She said it like environmental consciousness was a hobby, a nice-to-have rather than a fundamental business principle. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was sitting in a restaurant that had been carbon neutral since opening, eating food sourced from partners within a 50-mile radius, surrounded by furniture rescued from landfills and given new life. "Rachel would know about that," Dad offered suddenly, as if remembering I existed. "She's always been into that recycling thing." The table's attention shifted to me briefly, polite smiles masking their disinterest. Tyler leaned forward with the patronizing enthusiasm of someone about to humor a child. "Oh, right. Melissa mentioned you work in waste management. That's important work." Before I could respond, Melissa jumped in with that protective tone that somehow managed to be more insulting than any direct attack. "Rachel does something with recycling and upcycling. It's really sweet she takes old things and makes them useful again. Very creative, in her own way." Creative in her own way, as if my work existed in some quaint parallel universe, disconnected from real business or meaningful impact. I nodded and took a sip of the organic wine we'd started serving 2 years ago, after I'd personally visited vineyards across Colorado to find producers who shared our values. The conversation moved on, relegating me back to the margins where I apparently belonged. "The presentation was incredible," Tyler's associate was saying about some tech conference. "The whole sustainable business model thing is really having a moment." A moment. As if sustainability was a fashion trend rather than a fundamental shift in how responsible businesses operated. "It's amazing how innovative some entrepreneurs are getting," Melissa added, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured, taking something everyone sees as trash and turning it into treasure. She had no idea how literally true that statement was. Every piece of art on these walls, every plank of reclaimed wood beneath their feet, every carefully restored vintage element in this room represented exactly that transformation, what others discarded. I had seen potential in... "The farm-to-table movement is everywhere now," Mom's friend observed, cutting into her appetizer locally sourced charcuterie from a producer I'd discovered at a farmer's market 3 years ago. "Though I have to say, sometimes it feels a bit... performative." Performative? I watched her savor the artisanal cheese that represented a partnership I'd built from scratch, helping a small dairy expand their distribution while maintaining their traditional methods. "Speaking of food," Tyler said, "this place is supposed to be amazing. Some local success story, chef-driven, sustainable, all that buzzword stuff. Cost a fortune to book this room." The casual dismissal of my life's work as buzzword stuff sent a familiar sting through my chest, but I'd learned to transform that sting into fuel years ago. "The ambiance is lovely," one of the aunts commented, glancing around at the living walls I'd designed to improve air quality while creating a connection to nature. Very earthy. Earthy, another diminutive word to describe something they couldn't quite categorize. "I wonder how they keep those plants alive indoors," Dad mused, looking at the vertical gardens that required a sophisticated irrigation system I'd spent months perfecting. I could have explained the hydroponic technology, the carefully balanced LED spectrum, the automated nutrient delivery system. Instead, I smiled and said nothing. The first course arrived Marcus's signature beet carpaccio with microgreens from our rooftop garden and house-made goat cheese from a partner farm in Boulder. I watched them taste my vision, seeing their faces light up with genuine pleasure. "This is incredible," Tyler said, and for the first time all evening, his enthusiasm seemed authentic. "The flavors are so complex." Melissa agreed, then added with characteristic thoughtlessness. "Though the presentation is a bit rustic, I mean. It's beautiful. But you'd think for what they're charging." She was critiquing the plating style I'd developed with Marcus over countless tastings, the aesthetic that had earned us 3 James Beard nominations and a feature in Food and Wine. I cut another piece of the carpaccio, tasting the culmination of relationships I'd built, techniques I'd refined, values I'd refused to compromise on. They thought they were judging a meal. They had no idea they were critiquing my soul. The invisibility reached its peak during the second course, when Tyler's college friend, some hedge fund prince named Bradley, turned to me with the kind of curiosity reserved for exotic pets. "So, Rachel, what exactly do you do?" Melissa mentioned something about a startup. Before I could open my mouth, Melissa laughed that practiced trill again. "Oh, Rachel's got this cute little thing going. She collects commercial waste, from restaurants and offices and turns it into, what do you call it again? Rach compost recycled materials." "Something like that," I murmured, watching Bradley's face arrange itself into polite disinterest. "It's not really a company," Melissa continued, clearly trying to be helpful while systematically dismantling my credibility. "More like a local service thing, very grassroots, very small scale." Small scale. I glanced around the room that could seat 40, part of a restaurant empire that processed over 2 tons of organic waste weekly through our proprietary composting system, the same system that had started in my garage 7 years ago. "That's nice," Bradley said with the patronizing kindness reserved for children's lemonade stands. "Good for you for finding your niche." Tyler chimed in with a grin. "At least someone's keeping our streets clean." "Right. We need people willing to do that kind of work." The table chuckled politely, and I felt myself becoming smaller in their eyes with each word. Not smaller in reality, I knew exactly who I was and what I'd built, but smaller in their perception, until I occupied the space they'd always reserved for me, the family oddball with her quirky environmental hobby. The important thing is that Rachel's happy," Mom added with that particular brand of maternal condescension that manages to be supportive and dismissive simultaneously. Not everyone needs to have big corporate careers. I employed more people than Tyler's startup, had been featured on the cover of Colorado Business Monthly, and had spoken at conferences from Seattle to Miami. But in this room, I was still the girl who played in dirt. "Absolutely," Tyler's business partner agreed. "The world needs all kinds. Someone has to handle the practical stuff." The practical stuff. As if sustainability was just a necessary chore rather than the future of business itself. I took another sip of wine and watched their faces as they enjoyed their second course, Marcus's wood-fired salmon with seasonal vegetables from our partner farms. They praised every bite, completely unaware that the practical stuff I handled had sourced every ingredient, designed every aspect of their experience, created the very environment that allowed them to feel sophisticated and worldly. "This restaurant really is exceptional," one of the aunts commented. "Everything tastes so fresh, so thoughtfully prepared." "It's that farm-to-table trend," Tyler explained confidently. "These places really know how to source quality ingredients." These places. He spoke about my restaurant like it was some abstract concept rather than the result of countless hours building relationships with local producers, developing sustainable practices, creating systems that supported both environmental responsibility and exceptional cuisine. "I read somewhere that the owner started in waste management too," Bradley said with amusement. "Funny how some people can parlay anything into a business these days." The irony was so thick I could cut it with the custom-forged knives my kitchen staff was using. They were literally discussing my origin story while dismissing the very path that had led to their current experience. Really? Melissa perked up with genuine interest. That's actually kind of inspiring. Going from trash to this. She gestured around the room I'd conceptualized, designed, and brought to life. Shows what's possible with enough ambition, Tyler agreed, though I'm sure they had investors, connections. You know the usual startup advantages. The usual startup advantages. Like the 2 years I'd lived on ramen and hope, the 16-hour days spent building equipment from salvaged parts, the rejections from every bank and investor I'd approached before finally bootstrapping my way to success. Still, Mom said thoughtfully, it takes vision to see potential where others see waste. For a moment, something flickered in her voice that sounded almost like pride, almost like recognition. But then she added, Rachel's always been good at seeing things differently. Remember when she wanted to turn that old shed into a playhouse? And just like that, I was relegated back to childhood whimsy, my business acumen reduced to a little girl's imagination. I sat quietly, watching them consume my vision while simultaneously denying my capacity to create it. They were experiencing the fruits of everything they claimed I could never achieve, all while maintaining the comfortable fiction that I remained exactly who they needed me to be: small, harmless, and safely beneath their notice. The beautiful, terrible irony was that they were absolutely right about one thing. It did take vision to see potential where others saw waste. They just had no idea they were the waste. And tonight, I was going to transform them too. I excused myself between courses, needing a moment to recalibrate. The bathroom I'd had custom designed with reclaimed subway tiles and living moss accents felt like a sanctuary. I stood before the mirror antique glass I'd salvaged from a demolished hotel and studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me wasn't the diminished figure they saw at that table. She was Rachel Monroe, CEO, founder, owner, the person who had transformed a garage full of composting equipment into a sustainable restaurant empire that employed over 300 people and generated 8 figures in annual revenue. I touched the walls I'd selected, felt the cool stone countertops I'd sourced from a quarry in Lyons. Every surface in this space bore my fingerprints, reflected my vision, embodied my values. This wasn't just a bathroom, it was a testament to the transformation they refused to see in me. CEO, I whispered to my reflection, founder, owner. The words felt like armor, strengthening my resolve for what was coming. When I returned to the table, something had shifted in my demeanor. I sat straighter, observed more intently, spoke when spoken to, but with a new quality of attention that I hadn't displayed before. I was no longer the family oddball trying to blend into the background. I was a predator studying her prey. The main course arrived with theatrical precision Marcus's signature dish, the one we'd spent 3 months perfecting together. Locally sourced duck breast with a cherry gastric made from fruit grown on our partner farm, accompanied by roasted root vegetables from soil that had been enriched by our composting program. I watched their faces light up as they tasted it, noting every expression of pleasure, every murmur of approval. This dish was my autobiography written in flavors, each component representing relationships I'd built, systems I'd developed, principles I'd refused to compromise. This is extraordinary, Tyler said, cutting another piece. The duck is perfectly cooked, and these vegetables I can actually taste the difference. They're so much more flavorful than what you usually get. Of course they were. I'd spent years working with farmers to develop soil enhancement programs, creating closed-loop systems where our composted waste enriched the very land that grew our ingredients. It was regenerative agriculture in action, but he experienced it simply as flavorful vegetables. The presentation is so artful, one of the aunts commented, admiring Marcus's plating style. Though I have to say, the portion seems a bit restrained for the price point. She was critiquing the intentional portion sizing that reflected our philosophy of quality over quantity, sustainability over excess. Every decision on that plate had been deliberate, ethical, revolutionary in its own quiet way. But to her, it was just stingy. "I suppose that's the fine dining aesthetic," Melissa said with a slight frown. "Though honestly, after working out this morning, I could eat twice this amount." Working out this morning. She had no idea that the vegetables on her plate represented hundreds of hours of labor, dozens of partnerships, years of building relationships with people who shared a vision of food as something more than mere consumption. "The sauce is incredible, though," Bradley admitted, dabbing his bread in the cherry gastrique. "Really complex flavors. You can tell the chef knows what they're doing." "The chef knows what they're doing because I spent 2 years working alongside him, tasting variations, adjusting techniques, refusing to compromise until we achieved something that honored both the ingredients and the principles behind them." "I wonder how they source ingredients like this," Mom mused, clearly enjoying the meal despite her subtle criticisms. "It must take quite a network." "Quite a network. I'd built that network relationship by relationship, farm visit by farm visit, handshake by handshake. It had taken 7 years of trust building, fair payment practices, and genuine partnership to create the supply chain that made tonight's meal possible. Probably costs a fortune to maintain quality like this," Tyler's business partner observed. "These sustainable practices always come with premium pricing." Premium pricing for premium practices. Every dollar spent on our sourcing supported local farmers, reduced carbon footprint, eliminated chemical pesticides, and created economic opportunities in rural communities. But he saw only cost, not value. As they continued to critique and praise elements of the meal in equal measure, I felt something crystallizing inside me. They were sitting in judgment of my life's work while remaining completely oblivious to their proximity to its creator. They were consuming my vision while denying my capacity to have one. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable, and beautifully so. I cut another piece of the duck, savoring both its flavor and the knowledge that very soon, the disconnect between their perceptions and reality would be obliterated. They thought they were enjoying a meal at some trendy restaurant. They had no idea they were eating at the table of the woman they'd been systematically underestimating for 34 years. The transformation was almost complete. Soon, the waste would become treasure, and the treasure would become devastatingly clear. The first crack in their carefully constructed reality came from an unexpected source. At the table beside ours, an older gentleman in an impeccably tailored suit was dining with what appeared to be his adult daughter. As dessert menus were being distributed, he turned toward our table with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being heard. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of old money and older manners. "I couldn't help but notice, are you involved with the design concept here? The sustainability integration is remarkably sophisticated." The question was directed at me, though I could feel the confusion rippling through my family's table. Why was this distinguished stranger asking me about restaurant design? "You could say that," I replied carefully, aware that every word was being weighed by multiple audiences. The living walls, the reclaimed materials, the closed-loop systems, it's not just aesthetic, it's functional sustainability. Whoever conceptualized this understands both environmental science and hospitality at a level most consultants never reach. Tyler leaned forward with sudden interest, his businessman's instincts sensing an opportunity to insert himself into what sounded like a lucrative conversation. "Are you in the restaurant business?" The man smiled. "Architecture, actually. I've been trying to convince clients to embrace this level of integration for years. Most restaurants treat sustainability as an afterthought, but this," he gestured around the room, "this is systems thinking made tangible." Melissa's brow furrowed as she tried to process why this conversation was happening at our table. "I'm sorry, but why are you asking Rachel about restaurant design?" The architect looked genuinely puzzled. "Because she clearly understands the principles behind what we're experiencing tonight. The waste stream management alone would require years of expertise to implement properly." "Waste stream management," Mom repeated slowly, as if the words were in a foreign language. "The composting systems, the packaging reduction protocols, the supplier partnership structures that eliminate transportation waste." the man explained enthusiastically. Someone spent serious time thinking through every environmental impact point. Bradley laughed uncomfortably. I think you might be overestimating our Rachel here. She does recycling, but this level of sophistication? He trailed off with a patronizing smile. The architect's confusion deepened. Recycling. This is comprehensive circular economy implementation, the technical knowledge required to design these systems. He stopped mid-sentence, clearly sensing the tension he'd inadvertently created. Tyler attempted to smooth things over with his trademark confidence. Rachel's got some great ideas about environmental stuff, but obviously a place like this would have professional consultants, systems architects, that sort of thing. Obviously, the man agreed politely, though his eyes remained curious as they settled on me. The moment stretched uncomfortably, filled with half-formed questions no one quite knew how to ask. I could feel the shift in energy around our table, the first hint that their neat categorizations might not be as airtight as they'd assumed. Well, the architect said finally, whoever designed this understands sustainability as business strategy, not just feel-good marketing. Brilliant work! He turned back to his own table, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the ones before. Melissa was the first to break it. That was weird. Why did he think you'd know about restaurant design? Maybe I just look like someone who pays attention, I said, taking a sip of the dessert wine that had just been poured, a local vintage we'd been serving since our second year in operation. But Tyler's businessman instincts were clearly pinging. His eyes had sharpened, and I could see him replaying the conversation, looking for patterns he'd missed. You seemed pretty comfortable discussing it, he observed carefully. I pay attention to sustainability practices, I replied. It's relevant to my work. Your recycling work, Mom said, but there was a new note of uncertainty in her voice. Among other things, the phrase hung in the air, heavy with implications none of them quite wanted to explore. I watched Tyler's face as he processed the exchange, saw the moment when his certainty began to crack. He was successful enough to recognize expertise when he encountered it, and something in that conversation had triggered his attention. Well, what other things, he asked directly, abandoning social niceties for the kind of probing question that had probably made him successful in business. Before I could answer, dessert arrived. Marcus's signature chocolate souffle with vanilla bean ice cream made from milk sourced from a dairy I'd personally visited 12 times over 3 years to ensure their practices aligned with our values. This looks incredible, Melissa said, clearly grateful for the distraction from the growing tension. I cut into the souffle, watching the warm chocolate flow onto the plate, and smiled. They thought the tension was uncomfortable now. They had no idea that the real earthquake was still coming, and when it hit, everything they thought they knew about their place in the world and mine would be completely rearranged. The architect's questions had been the first hairline crack in their certainty, but cracks, I'd learned in 7 years of business, had a tendency to spread. The earthquake began with a woman's voice from across the dining room. "Excuse me," she called out, loud enough to carry over the ambient conversation. She was standing at her table, wine glass in hand, addressing Devin, who was making his rounds through the main dining area. "Is the owner dining with guests tonight?" The question cut through our private room's atmosphere like a blade. Every conversation at our table stopped mid-sentence, all attention shifting toward the doorway where Devin stood, clearly visible from our seats. Devin's professional smile never wavered, but I caught the subtle glance he shot in my direction, a question mark seeking permission. I gave him the slightest nod. "Yes," he replied clearly, his voice carrying easily into our room. "Ms. Monroe is having dinner with family this evening. She prefers to keep things low-key." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen ventilation system humming 3 rooms away. "Monroe," Tyler said slowly, like he was testing the weight of the word. Before anyone could process that bombshell fully, Melissa's cousin Jamie, barely 22 and never one to read a room, had her phone out and was frantically typing. "Wait, wait, wait," she said, her voice rising with excitement. "Rachel Monroe! Oh my God! Oh my God!" Her screen lit up with a video my TED Talk from last year, the one about reimagining waste as resource, about building circular economies from the ground up, the one that had gone viral and led to speaking engagements across the country. "Is this you?" Jamie thrust her phone toward me, but she was already answering her own question. "It is. This is my cousin. This is literally my cousin." The blood drained from Melissa's face as she stared at the screen showing me on the TED stage, speaking to an audience of 3,000 about transforming commercial waste streams into sustainable business models. Tyler grabbed the phone, his eyes darting between the screen and my face. You're that Rachel Monroe, the sustainability entrepreneur." The one who built the restaurant empire," Bradley added, his earlier condescension replaced by something approaching awe. But Jamie wasn't finished. She was on her feet now, walking toward the main dining room with her phone held high. "Excuse me, everyone," she called out. "This is Rachel Monroe, the owner. She's here." What happened next felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. The architect who'd questioned me earlier stood up with a knowing smile. Other diners began turning in their seats. Someone started clapping, and the applause spread like wildfire through the dining room. Within moments, the wall-mounted screen that usually displayed our daily specials was showing my TED Talk, projected large enough for the entire restaurant to see. The irony was exquisite. There I was on screen, talking about the power of overlooked resources, while sitting unrecognized at a table full of people who had spent the evening overlooking me. "The most valuable resources are often the ones we discard," my recorded voice said from the speakers. "The trick is learning to see potential where others see waste." The applause grew louder. Diners were standing now, some pulling out phones to take pictures. Devin appeared in our doorway with a look of barely contained amusement. "Should I ask them to tone it down?" he asked, though his eyes were dancing with mischief. I looked around our table at the faces staring back at me, shock, confusion, dawning realization, and in Tyler's case, the rapid calculations of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew. "No," I said, standing slowly. "I think it's time everyone knew exactly who they're dining with." The dining room erupted in cheers as I stepped into view. Through the wall of windows, I could see people taking photos, hear conversations buzzing with excitement about the surprise appearance of the restaurant owner. But in our private room, the silence was deafening. Mom's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. Dad looked like he was trying to solve a complex mathematical equation. Melissa's face had gone from white to red to a shade of green that matched our living walls. Tyler was the first to find his voice. "You own this place. You actually own this entire restaurant." "This restaurant," I confirmed, "and 4 others across Colorado, plus the catering company, the urban farming initiative, and the waste management consulting firm that works with restaurants across the western United States." "The little recycling thing?" Bradley whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "The thing about seeing potential in waste," I continued, my voice carrying clearly over the continuing applause from the main dining room, "is that it applies to more than just materials. It applies to people too, to assumptions, to family dynamics that have outlived their usefulness." Melissa looked like she might be sick. "Rachel, we didn't." "No," I finished for her. "No, you didn't. But you also didn't ask. You didn't listen. You didn't consider that maybe, just maybe, the woman you've been dismissing for years might have built something extraordinary." The applause from the dining room was finally beginning to die down, but the reckoning in our private room was just beginning. I looked around the table at their stunned faces, savoring this moment I'd been unconsciously building toward for 7 years. "Welcome to my restaurant," I said simply. "I hope you've enjoyed your evening." The silence stretched until I thought it might snap under its own weight. Finally, I walked back to my seat, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I stood behind my chair, the one they'd positioned furthest from Honor, closest to the wall, and looked at each of them in turn. You want to know what I do? I said, my voice steady and clear. I built this. Not just this restaurant, but everything you've experienced tonight. Every bite of food you praised came from relationships I cultivated. Every design element you admired was chosen by these hands you thought were only good for handling trash. I gestured around the room, taking inventory of my kingdom. The reclaimed wood table you're sitting at, I personally selected and restored it. The living walls you found so charming, I designed the irrigation system. The wine you've been drinking, I visited those vineyards, tasted dozens of varieties, negotiated partnerships that support both quality and sustainability. Melissa's eyes were filling with tears, but I wasn't finished. The little recycling thing you've been so dismissive of, it's a comprehensive waste management system that's been replicated by restaurants across 3 states. The startup you said wasn't a real company. It employs over 300 people and generates more revenue than most of the businesses represented at this table. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. The woman you called poor trash worker owns the building you're sitting in, designed the menu you've been eating, and trained the staff who've been serving you all evening with the kind of excellence you assumed I could never achieve. I reached into my purse and pulled out my business card, the one with the elegant logo, and my title clearly printed Founder and CEO, Monroe Sustainable Hospitality Group. I placed it on the table in front of Melissa. This is who I am. This is what I've built. And you've spent the entire evening sitting in the monument to everything you told me I'd never accomplish, dismissing the very person who created your experience. Mom finally found her voice, barely a whisper. Rachel, we're proud of you. We just didn't understand. You didn't understand because you never asked, I interrupted. You decided who I was 7 years ago and refused to update your information, even when the evidence was literally surrounding you. I looked around the table one final time, meeting each pair of eyes that had spent the evening looking through me instead of at me. You thought you were having dinner at some trendy restaurant, judging everything from the portion sizes to the pricing structure. You had no idea you were critics reviewing my autobiography, written in food and design, and 7 years of relentless work. The weight of their realization was almost visible, settling over the table like dust after an explosion. But here's the thing about transformation, I continued, my voice softening slightly. It's never too late to see clearly. The question is whether you're willing to look. I stepped back from the table, straightening my jacket, the one Melissa had suggested I'd borrowed for the occasion. Dinner tonight is on the house, I said. Consider it my engagement gift to Melissa and Tyler, and a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life come from the people and places you least expect. Devin appeared in the doorway, reading the situation perfectly. Ms. Monroe, your car is ready whenever you are. I nodded to him, then looked back at my family one last time. Thank you for coming to my restaurant, I said. I hope it was illuminating. I walked toward the door, pausing only when Melissa's voice caught me. Rachel, wait. I turned back, seeing her face crumpled with something that might have been genuine remorse. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. For a moment, the anger that had fueled this entire evening softened into something more complex. She was still my sister, after all. They were still my family, flawed and limited as their vision had been. I know, I said simply, but sorry doesn't change the 7 years of dismissal. It doesn't erase tonight. What changes things is what you do next. I left them sitting in the restaurant I'd built, surrounded by the evidence of everything they'd refused to see. As Devin walked me to the exit, I could hear the continuing buzz of excitement from other diners, the energy of recognition and celebration filling the space I'd created from nothing but vision and determination. Good evening, Ms. Monroe, the valet said as he brought my car around. I hope you had a pleasant dinner. I smiled, breathing in the cool Denver air outside the restaurant that bore my name in small, elegant letters by the door. It was exactly what I needed, I replied. And for the first time in 7 years, that was completely true. Huh? Thank you so much for listening to Rachel's story of transformation and recognition. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story right now? Are you at home, commuting, taking a break at work? Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about Rachel's journey. Have you ever been underestimated by people who should have known you better? I'd love to hear your stories too.